Welcome everyone to the Hurting Humanity channel. This right here is a blueprint on how you destabilize a country. If you didn't see my video earlier, I talked about how Cuba is under a full-on blackout. The entire electrical grid in the country of Cuba is off. I'm not talking about a county in Florida or a small region somewhere. An entire country has lost electricity. And this is how you destabilize a country. This is how you turn a country into a humanitarian crisis. Because now, conveniently, while the grid is off in Cuba, they're getting hit with earthquakes and hurricanes. Tropical storm / Hurricane Oscar has conveniently also made its way to Cuba. But for those of you that don't know, here's just a little look at the nationwide blackout across Cuba and how people are chanting, "We want electricity." Keep in mind what I talked about, of how you would get civilians to consent, how you would get civilians to give in to government overreach by doing things like this, by shutting off power grids. People will beg the government for electricity because they become so dependent on electricity. Zero civilians know how to make their own electricity for the most part. Zero civilians know how to farm or find drinkable water or make drinkable water. So, of course, people will become dependent on the government. So say the government says, hey, you want electricity back on? Hey, you want food and water? That's fine. But in return, you're going to have to make sure you all have a shot, because we're going to need to have nano inside of you all at some point for this entire thing to work, to have you connected to the Internet of Bodies. But this is how you start bringing a country to its knees. And this is the blueprint that they're going to be using around the earth. They're going to use the electrical grid to gain more control over civilians by shutting off power. And then, of course, use weaponized weather to destroy the grid itself to bring about a new power grid, right? This is how you get AI governance. This is how you get people dependent on green energy, by doing things like this.
Tonight, Cuba is a country in crisis. At least 10 million across the communist nation without power for the second time in 24 hours after one of the island's major power plants failed on Friday. The blackout putting angry residents closer to the brink of catastrophe amid repression and already growing shortages of clean water, fuel, and food. Because there is no one who can stand this, says this visibly frustrated resident. Regime officials blaming the problem on aging, crumbling infrastructure, already the source of regular rolling blackouts across the island, and on a shortage of fuel imports. The outrage pouring on the streets, with chants of, "We want electricity." The government declaring an emergency shutdown in a last-ditch effort to conserve what little energy was left.
This is a fatal blow of the failed policies, the failures of the Cuban regime on the Cuban people.
Amalia Dace is a scholar of the Cuban experience at the University of Pennsylvania.
Is there any reason to believe that the Cuban government is going to be able to resolve this issue?
No, I don't think they're going to be able to resolve the issue. I believe they're going to continue to blame the United States for its problems, as it's done for the last 65 years.
Cuba's president has vowed there won't be any rest until the power is back on. But a new hurricane on the horizon, expected to hit Cuba tomorrow, could only deepen this disaster. George Solis, NBC News.
So in addition to that, in addition to the power going off, if people out there are not familiar, we saw another hurricane, which they said turned into a tropical storm, which took another bizarre weather pattern, which made a direct turn right from the Bahamas into Cuba. And I want to play this news report for you, because I want you to hear this term that's used about hurricane hunters, right? This is more programming. We've seen this with movies like Twister, right? Where people hunt tornadoes. Oh, what are they doing? They're driving to the middle of the tornado so they can get those crystal balls up into the tornado so that they can study tornadoes. Well, they're using mind control like this to convince the sheeple out there that the government and government military agencies have hurricane hunters. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a government agency, flies planes into these hurricanes so that they can gather data on the weather. But the reality of the matter is this is exactly how they weaponize storms and steer them. But listen to this guy, this newscaster, talk about how hurricane hunters went directly into the middle of the hurricane.
Let's talk about the tropics. Oscar is still a hurricane. It rapidly strengthened into one yesterday, and we only found that out because hurricane hunters flew a plane through the middle of this yesterday. It is a very tiny, compact system, and it remains a hurricane as it's drifting from the southeastern Bahamas, but it likely will impact eastern Cuba with some hurricane conditions over that small area. A little bit later on today, hurricane hunters have been flying through this, and they're finding the pressure slightly lower, so it may be strengthening just a little bit, and it still has a few hours to do so, but I don't expect much, making that turn and eventually affecting the southeast Bahamas again Tuesday into Wednesday. And we only found that out because hurricane hunters flew a plane through the middle of this yesterday. Hurricane hunters have been flying through this.
So here we have hurricane hunters. Are we supposed to believe this is just a group of courageous people that really want data on storms, so they fly directly into storms like complete lunatics? Because if you heard there was a hurricane and you were driving into it, wouldn't you say, that's insane? Kind of like what we hear with all these cruise ships during these hurricanes that continue to travel out at sea because they tell everyone out there, well, we're not going to go near the pattern of the storm. We're going to go away from the storm. But they're actually using those cruise ships as another way to use their antennas on the cruise ships to modify and manipulate the weather. So you heard him say flat out in the open about hurricane hunters. And if people don't know about Project Cyrus, you've probably seen my videos where I've talked about all of these different patents that the government has when it comes to weather modification. But specifically Project Cyrus, for anyone out there doesn't know, you could just do a basic search if you want. Because I know that the sheeple out there, if you give them information, they need it from Google itself, the government themselves, for them to actually believe it. If you say it's from this website or that website, they refuse to believe it. So they can actually do this themselves. Project Cyrus was a weather modification project that was the first to attempt to seed a hurricane with dry ice in 1947. The project was a collaboration between the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force and General Electric Corporation. You know, GE, General Electric. You might say to yourself, well, why would General Electric work with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force? Well, because the corporation itself is the government. So the project, which was initiated in 1947, it is 2024 going on 2025, okay? It was initiated in 1947 to study cloud particles and modifications, right? That's what they tell you. On October 13th, 1947, two B-17s and a B-29 dropped nearly 180 pounds of dry ice into the clouds of Hurricane Cape Sable. The crew reported that the cloud deck was modified. However, the hurricane changed direction and made landfall in Savannah, Georgia, causing local destruction. The project was canceled and seeding research was set back to more than a decade. Now, of course, we know that the projects aren't canceled. This is when people actually figure out what's going on with the government every time they say, well, we ceased operations, right? Just like they told us they stopped using HARP. Just like they told us they stopped using MK when civilians realized the government was performing experiments on unparticipating civilians through mind control operations. So they don't ever turn these things off. They just tell you that they stopped doing it, right? But that's enough for the sheeple to believe, to say, oh, well, see, they said they stopped doing it, right? So the public back then blamed the seeding and lawsuits were threatened. However, evidence showed that the storm had already begun to turn when seeding began, and a similar path had been taken by a system in 1906. And of course, that's just their misinformation, the aftermath of what happened. But people actually saw the bizarre weather patterns like people are seeing now and called the government out for it. The difference is that the government has more control over the information flow now than they did back then, because they could censor truth and most people get their information from the internet. But back then, people were gathering together. People were gathering kind of like we just saw with Helene, where they were saying something's wrong here. The mainstream media isn't reporting on this correctly. There's more people dead than they're telling us. FEMA isn't giving us assistance. They're rounding people up and, in fact, preventing people from coming in and helping civilians in need. So the reason I show you hurricane hunters and even mentioning Project Cyrus, which is one of many weather modification projects the government has used, is because clearly this is them destabilizing Cuba. Now, people out there have this impression of Cuba. Cuba's a third world country. Cuba is a wreck. It doesn't matter, whatever your perception of it is. They could turn any country into Cuba overnight because they have control over the power grids and they can manipulate and modify the weather so that you can't blame it on your own government. And that's the point. That's the point. Now, in addition to those things, in addition to the power being shut off and the hurricane, there are reports that a 5.0 earthquake also hit off the coast of Cuba as well, which tells us that there is a massive operation going on here. Weather modification is being used. Cuba is clearly the target. And in fact, they're shutting off the power grid. So we need to keep an eye on what happens in Cuba because we can expect similar things around the earth. We could expect grid shutdowns. We could expect storm after storm after storm. What's the answer for Cuba is the next thing, right? How does Cuba get back on track with anyone who survives what's going on there because they don't have electricity? Well, the answer is what we're going to have to look at and say this is the solution that they want to bring in, which we all already should know is them changing the grid over to a green energy grid, a controllable energy grid, and civilians saying, you know what, fine, just give us some type of electricity. We need running water. Give us some type of electricity. I need a shower. Give me some running electricity. It's hot. I need air condition. And this is where the government's rationing of your resources comes into play because once the green energy grid is in place, people will just be thankful to have electricity again and won't realize that it's the government doing this deliberately via sabotage to gain control over the power grid so they could ration electricity where you live and literally turn you into a prisoner. That's the goal. I've said it a million times, right? Prisoner, lights off, 8 o'clock. Prisoner, X amount of recess hours, right? Think about all the stuff that just happened with the outbreak. Curfews in place. How long were you allowed to go outside your home? Were you allowed to go outside your home? Did you have to distance from people when you were outside? Government overreach on steroids is what this starts to become. So the stories out there right now about Oscar making landfall in eastern Cuba Sunday evening into Monday amid already the power blackout is adding fears that the storm may prove to be especially dangerous. Oscar made landfall as a Category 1 in Cuba before 6 p.m. Sunday night. After landfall in the Bahamas, according to the National Hurricane Center, by 11 o'clock, the winds sustained about 75 to 70 miles per hour. Cuba's electrical grid collapsed on Sunday for the fourth time in 48 hours. Okay, the fourth time in 48 hours, marking a major setback in the government's efforts to quickly restore power to exhausted residents already suffering from severe shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. And that word exhausted is very, very important in the New World Order's playbook. They're going to beat people into exhaustion, compliance via exhaustion. They're going to exhaust you to death with things like having no electricity to the point where you go, fine, I'll take whatever they're going to give. Fine, I'll take it just to have electricity. We've become too dependent on the government. They already know this. Right? They already know this by creating these falsehoods around us like the American dream and everybody being distracted with nonsense all the time. Nobody's thought to themselves, what would happen if a tyrannical government came in place and they had control over the power grid and whether I could run a refrigerator or not, and whether I'd be able to store food at my home, or whether or not I'd be able to do this or do that. They have control over everything now. Everything. Because civilians don't have the ability to do anything on their own. That's the whole point, at least in my opinion, of this American dream illusion that they've created in this country. It was to tell you to go sit at a desk, go to an institution/college, go learn this nonsense that will not be suitable in a survival situation. It'll be suitable for you to go post on your social media accounts so you could brag about where you work and what your social status is. And then when we shut things down, you'll realize that you don't have a single clue whatsoever about how to do anything to survive because you've taken for granted things like food and water, and you thought that those were just guarantees in life. And you didn't realize, wait a minute, they're not guarantees in life. You should always have plans in place to be able to feed your family and provide water for your family or for yourself. And that plan isn't going to Ralph's. That plan isn't going to ShopRite. That plan should always have been for all of us to not be dependent on the government and to realize that we need these things in place. We need to learn how to farm. We need to learn how to make our own electricity to sustain our own needs. But we haven't. And Cuba is a perfect example of what's to come. This is how you collapse a country. So the government, on top of everything else, while people are now suffering from food shortages, remember, they've made people dependent on medicine, on pharma magic, okay, pharmaceuticals. They've made people dependent on it. And now they can't get their medicine, so people are getting sick and dying. We have probably tons of, bacterial infections probably with some of the flooding and everything else that could be going on there. We have a shortage of food and we have no drinkable water and of course no fuel to move around. So the government canceled schools in Cuba for the week, a rare move in Cuba, citing the hurricane and ongoing energy crisis. Officials said only essential workers should report to work. I mean, these are things that we've heard in the past, right? Only essential workers. If you remember during the outbreak, and I know a lot of you didn't follow my channel, and some of you did. I mean, so many people lost touch with my content. I talked then about the carbon footprint and how this was all precursor for the climate agenda. They whispered at it. They were whispering at things when it came to mask wearing, because they were saying, hey, do you know that carbon emissions are lowering because people have masks on? And people are going, what are these people talking about? We have an outbreak right now. They're talking about that. They were giving you little signs that the future was going to be everything we saw during the outbreak, just worse, because it was going to be permanent, the way that we lived. That was a test run. How many people actually followed orders? How many people did what they were told? How many people went and voluntarily poisoned themselves? These are all things that they were monitoring data on. Because remember, the data they're studying is us. They look at us like lab rats. They're listening, they're monitoring, they're following, they're obviously censoring if they think anybody out there could reach people's minds and wake them up and pull them out of the hive. But that was really the test run. So when you hear them say only essential workers, that sentence should sound familiar to you, right? They say Hurricane Center forecasters expect the storm to weaken soon. Eastern Cuba is forecast to receive up to 12 inches of rain through Wednesday morning. And what we're seeing right now is weather modification attacks everywhere, right? We just had another flash flood occur in New Mexico, one they're calling historic, catastrophic, out of nowhere, where flash flooding is putting people completely underwater. We're not talking about a storm coming through. We're talking about suddenly getting hit with so much rain that you have feet of water surrounding your home, flooding inside your home, flooding the roads. And what do you think that does to infrastructure? What do you think that does, not just to buildings, to electrical grids? Destroys them. These are the ways that they're going to do it. These are the ways they're going to force you into compliance with what their plan is. They know people would never comply to what they wanted from the get-go. Now they're using what the plan has always been, weaponized weather. You could even hear them talk during storms. I mean, the news clip, it's laughable, right? Hurricane hunters. And you just go, what in the world is there's a common person out there go, what is a hurricane hunter? And they probably might. And they would just go, well, it's just somebody like in the movie Twister, right? They hunt the tornadoes, right? Oh, and you don't think that they're actually manipulating them. You don't think they're going in there, manipulating them, driving right into them, or those cruise ships that are out to sea during hurricanes that never get canceled. Nobody's suspicious of this. Well, the cruise ship's going in a different direction of the storm. Well, what if people not go on the boat? And they say, well, a lot of people didn't go on a lot of the cruises during Milton or Helene, but the boats still ran, right? For anyone that might have wanted to go, because they need the ships out there for the antennas on the ship to steer the weather, right? And there's a lot of antennas now around us. I keep saying it. You got antennas all around you now. You may notice them every time you go out. On farms, on highways, those 5G towers are modification towers. It's all around us now, not just on military bases. They could steer these things where they want to steer them. They could send planes in and call them hurricane hunters to do things like Project Cyrus, and they could just drop hundreds or thousands of pounds of dry ice into the clouds to steer. I mean, there's so many things that they've perfected now, while people have been distracted with nonsense and people don't even realize that it's happening around them because they've been programmed into thinking things like you can't control Mother Nature. So Cuba looks like a blueprint, right? You got an entire country with a grid shut off. I showed you in the video, if you didn't see it, on Cuba already, okay? The same exact narrative that's in Cuba is in the United States of America. If you haven't paid attention, and I know most people don't because it's not how their brains work. This is the content I try to provide is to show you the pattern, right? And what they're saying. They've been showing us propaganda over the last decade about the U.S. power grid failing. They've been showing us propaganda about another Carrington event. All boogeymen that they're creating, when the reality is they're going to be pressing an off switch and they're going to be using weaponized weather to destroy these areas while they shut the power grids off, then flood out the power grid system. So it's forcing them into a new grid system in general. And they'll say, well, maybe this will turn out to be something useful, this whole storm. Maybe these hurricanes and these tornadoes that wiped out cities and towns and communities, maybe in the long run, it's a good thing because now we could get these green energy grids in place and we'll all be thankful to Big Brother and thankful to the corporations who are providing the money to put these things in place, right? Just so we could run our electricity for a little while when people will never realize that they're the ones responsible for doing it in the first place. But they'll tell you that these events will eventually, these are good things because now, 200 years from now, carbon emissions will be reduced because we've changed the electrical grid, right? Sacrifice, right? We all had to make the sacrifice. But the reality of the matter is they're doing this deliberately. Cuba is a blueprint. Electrical grid, hurricanes steered right towards there with, hurricane adventurer. What's the term? That these hurricane hunters that just fly into there. Then the storm takes a bizarre turn. They weren't even expecting to get hit. And it took a weird turn. It was like on a dime. It stopped and it went back northeast. Oh, not to mention an unreported earthquake that occurred on the coast. So watch these stories closely. Watch them closely because they use the same script everywhere. That's another thing people need to realize. They have one script with different actors. The stuff with Trump and Harris/Biden. I've shown you the scripts in other countries like Spain. We see them in Argentina. They roll these guys out. They're literally carbon copies of one another. Oh, we have the left-right divide. We have these over-the-top bully Republicans. We have these democratic disasters where it's very clear when you look at them that they're brain dead, that they have, they can't form a thought. Everything's about feelings. It's carbon copy script. So we can look at these events and say it's a carbon copy too, because they've been telling us about the U.S. power grid for a long time. And it's only a matter of time before we get more Miltons, more Helenes. They're watching how we respond to these events. And then they're also planning out different ways that they can make sure that they could hit us with these things and nobody will be suspicious of it. That's why I think the next major event is going to be an earthquake. And I'll cover that in another video because there's predictive programming out there telling us that there's a major earthquake coming. Because now everybody's attention is on HAARP. People are starting to pay attention to HAARP, but a lot of people don't know about the earthquake machine. A lot of people don't know about it, right? So you start hitting people that place with the earthquake machine. We know a lot of people know of HAARP. It's been mentioned. They've done shows about HAARP, right? Most people can't grasp what it is, how they steer these storms, what those antennas are, right? And they want you saying HAARP now because even if people are exposing weather modification, everybody's looking up to Alaska. Most people aren't talking about how HAARP is pretty much installed in every military base or the fact that these 5G towers are now up everywhere and can be used as antennas as well, right? In the video that I did showing you the storms over in France, I showed you the storms in Dubai. You could literally see how they're using antennas to steer these things. Well, what do you think the 5G towers are? They're more than just radiation poison towers. They're doing more than just affecting our mental health and giving us cancer and things like that. They're doing a lot more than that. They have the ability to do many things, and they're being used to steer storms. I can guarantee that. But people are looking at HAARP, but they're not looking at, well, wait, could a 5G tower, wait, should we take these things down? Should we put our focus into that? So once earthquakes start hitting in weird spots, which, again, I'm going to cover in another video, once those start hitting, none of these people have a clue about Tesla's earthquake machine, which many people don't believe this Tesla's actual earthquake machine. Let's just call it what it is, fallen angel technology earthquake machines, okay? The ability to do it is there. They have the capability to do it. Turkey was the perfect example. People should be talking about Turkey every day. We're talking about 60,000 people that were killed in this earthquake. How many people have heard about that? Not many. I bring it up to people. They're like, oh, I didn't even know that they had one. Shouldn't that be national news every night? Well, it doesn't really fit an agenda, right? So why would it be on the news? Why would they inform you about this crisis over there? How many people died? How all of Turkey was destroyed in an earthquake and how those clouds formed above in the sky before it actually happened, right? Well, they don't want you to get suspicious of weather modification when it comes to earthquakes as well. All of it. They have their hand in all of it. And I know a lot of people out there believe that it's God's wrath. You could believe that it's God's wrath if you choose to, but you can't deny the fact that the government has the capability to do this because they do, and it's been proven. Prayers for people affected out by any of these storms, people in Cuba, whatever country they're in. It's absolutely disgusting what's going on. But anybody that looks at this and doesn't say that this isn't a blueprint to sabotage a country isn't paying attention, because that's exactly how this thing is going to play out all around the earth. Blackouts, storms, whether it's hurricanes or earthquakes or tsunamis, destroying infrastructure, civilians exhausted to the point of begging the government, even accepting green energy, accepting whatever they'll give them because they don't know how to survive, because they've pretty much been taught useless information their entire lives, right? They've been taught not how to farm, not how to, find or filter fresh water. They've been taught things like communications in school or economics in school, right? How to sit at a desk and answer phones. And now the government knows it's time. It's time to round up the cattle and herd them. And that's what they're doing. I thank everybody for being here. Hope you're all doing well. God bless you and your families as always.